Hi. This is Novel Admire. Welcome to my channel. Have fun. Mages are too op. Chapter 1, Head Explosion. It was a ceiling that he had never seen before. After Roland opened his eyes, he saw an enormous statue of a woman above his head. The statue was made of black rock, with vague greenness flowing on the surface. But when he observed it more carefully, the greenness was gone. Roland sat up and found himself on a blue stone platform that seemed like a ritual table for sacrifices in the medieval age. It was cold and rough. There was a unique fragrance in the air. He looked around and saw strange grasses burning below the statue of the goddess not far away behind him. The grasses seemed to be wormwood, albeit with more teeth at the edge. Wait. Fragrance? He could smell and even feel? Roland touched the ritual table again, sensing its roughness and coldness. He then sniffed hard. This time, he smelled both the strange fragrance of the grasses and the bitter scent of the stone building itself. Am I really not hypnotized, but in an immersive game? It feels so real. Roland looked at his hands. They were fair and slim, as expected of the hands of a spellcaster. He pinched his arm. There was pain. But not too obvious. It came as no surprise. After all, before he entered the game, he had read the official announcement which stated that the pain in the game was only 1/10 of that in reality. Roland rose from the platform. He looked around and realized that he was in a building made of rocks. There was a goddess statue, a ritual table, and several rows of chairs up ahead. Judging from the arrangement, it was likely to be a chapel. Jumping from the ritual table, Roland observed his body. He was wearing gray and brown clothes made of linen, which was not exactly comfortable. His shoes were ugly and thin. He could feel the cold stone below his feet as he stepped on the ground. It's very real. Roland sighed and touched the ritual table. The stones felt so real. The granules on their surface were identical to reality. He did not expect the game to be a legitimate immersive game exactly as Penguin Corporation claimed, not a VR counterfeit that intended to fool people's money. When was such great technology developed? And how could it have been developed by Penguin Corporation? Roland sighed with mixed feelings. The immersive cabin that he bought with $50,000 was definitely worth it. He was about to observe the environment some more and adapt himself to his new body, when the ragged door of the chapel opened. While the door was still creaking, a hunched old man walked in. His eyebrows were long and white and dangled to his slender cheeks. His eyelids were so loose that they almost covered his eyes. He was wearing a long white robe that had a symbol of a tree at the center. Before he joined the game, Roland had studied the basics of this game world from its official website. If he recalled correctly, the clothes were the standard uniform of the Church of Life. Only the reverends of the Church of Life wore them. The old man was surprised to see Roland at first, but then he relaxed. The change in his expression, both the movement of his facial muscles and his eyes, was exactly like that of a real person, instead of an NPC in the game. In the VR games that Roland had played, facial changes had always been a flaw in NPC behavior no matter how real the NPCs seemed to be. Even though NPCs' expressions were abundant thanks to motion capture, one would inevitably feel horrible when they changed their expressions. But right now, Roland felt that he had met a real person. Was the newcomer another player? He dropped the idea very soon. He was among the first batch to join the game. It was impossible for a player to become a reverend so quickly. Also, more importantly, players all appeared as young human beings in the game, and what Roland saw was a withering old man. However, the old man was too real. Roland felt that he was a real person even though he did not talk and was only staring at Roland. His eyes, his stance, his blinking eyes, his moles, his dry and yellow skin. He could even see that the old man's temples were vaguely throbbing because of the flow of blood. Roland was not involved in the game industry, but he had played a lot of games, including Pac-Man at the beginning and the exquisite VR games right now. Even though the games today could make NPCs look vivid, they still lacked the critical essence, which was the soul. Yet, the old man gave the feeling that he was a living person with a soul, instead of an NPC built with cold data inside a human skin, when he was doing nothing but standing. Is this a guiding NPC? The official website did not mention anything about a guiding NPC. Confused, Roland asked, "Hello, mister. What is this place?" The old man was stunned for a while. Then, he waved his hand and spoke in a language that Roland had never heard. Even though he could not understand, Roland had inferred from the old man's countenance that he was expressing his inability to understand Roland. Shoot! Roland cursed the producer of this game for their pursuit of perfection. Had they set up different languages for the NPCs in this world? If the introduction on the official website was to be believed, there were dozens of countries and races in this game world. If every country and every race had their own language, how much work would have to be done? If it was true, Blizzard and Ubisoft would be nothing but kindergarteners in front of Penguin Corporation. Though dissatisfied, Roland had a solution. He remembered that he had pre-learned language proficiency, a level 2 spell, when he created the character in the game. In many of the sandbox games he played, although everybody used the same language, the players of different countries or sides would hear and see random words if they did not know each other's language thanks to the setting of the games. Roland felt lucky that he had abundant game experience. He summoned the system in his mind. He was clumsy at first. After all, an immersive game was different from a VR game. But soon, he got the hang of it and found skills on Magic Book. Then, he locked on language proficiency. A strange chart popped up in front of his eyes, with a lot of blue nodes on it. A blue node that seemed to be the starting point glittered and shot a streak of redness to another node in the blink of an eye. Is this a spellcasting chart? While Roland considered the possibility, the red link between the two nodes suddenly began to tremble. Then, it trembled harder and harder, and Roland felt a stronger and stronger headache. What's going on? Roland had played games for 20 years, but it was the first time he played an immersive one. He had no experience and did not know how to deal with the situation. Several seconds later, the red link finally broke apart in the violent quakes. Before that, the pain in Roland's head was already insufferable, as if needles had been stuck inside. The moment the red link broke apart, Roland's consciousness was ejected out of his body in the game. Then, he discovered, to his surprise, that his game character's head exploded. The headless corpse fell heavily on the ground, blood splashing everywhere. Roland's consciousness stood next to the corpse as a transparent soul. He was so surprised that he froze and did not know how to react. The old man's hair, face, and clothes were covered with blood. He opened his mouth that had few teeth left, stunned. Chapter 2, Resurrection. Falcon was the only reverend in the Church of Life in Red Mountain Town. He worked as a mercenary for 2 years and traveled in a lot of places when he was young. Although he had only lived in Red Mountain Town afterward, he always considered himself a worldly man. But today, he felt that he was too ignorant. He did not know the new way of suicide, which was to detonate one's own head with magic recoil. Every spellcaster would have been impressed by such an accurate detonation. Falcon finally closed his mouth. The young man who emerged in his temple should be the undying golden sun that would arrive today according to the oracle, which said that he would reappear on the ritual table in the temple after he died. But what if he didn't? There were so many temples of the Church of Life in the world, and there were only finite golden suns. He might not reach his temple. Now, how should he deal with this headless body and this place that looked like the scene of a homicide? He had been a reputable reverend in Red Mountain Town for decades. He did not expect this before his death. It would be the time of prayer in the town soon. If the villagers saw him standing in the chapel soaked in blood next to the headless male, he could imagine what theory the villagers would come up with. It took the Church of Life decades to establish grounds in this village. If the villagers lost their faith because of this incident, he would be too ashamed to face the goddess when he was summoned by her later. Falcon had a strong headache. The thing he most dreaded happened. The wooden door behind Falcon opened, and a plump lady cried as loudly as if she were a virtuoso when she saw the horrifying scene. She even fell on the floor when Falcon turned around with brains and blood all over his body. "Don't be scared, Susan," said Falcon intimidatingly. "I'm Falcon. About this." "What? You're Reverend Falcon?" Surprisingly, the plump lady named Susan relaxed after distinguishing Falcon's voice. She jumped up and cursed at Roland's headless body. "Reverend, was he a burglar? You've done a great job. Wait a moment. I'll ask other people to help you. He was stupid enough to rob you." Cursing, she left and cried out, "Somebody help! The old Reverend has killed a burglar. Come here and help him move the body out." Hearing the exclamations and yells, Falcon grinned, tears in his dirty eyes. Soon, a bunch of people swarmed in. Most of them were adults, children were kept outside. They gasped when they saw the ghastly scene and then cursed the burglar who broke into the temple. None of them suspected that Falcon was a murderer. After discussing for a while, some of them fetched clean water to mop the floor, and some went for a piece of cloth to move the body away and burn it. More people were gathered around old Falcon, asking if he was hurt. They obviously cared about him. Some even wiped the disgusting blood stains on his clothes for him. None of them, including old Falcon, saw that Roland's consciousness had stayed next to his body. To be more exact, Roland was invisible to them when he was in the state of consciousness. Roland finally returned to himself from the unexpected pain. He confirmed that his body in the game had been killed by the head explosion due to inappropriate spell casting. It was one of the most hilarious ways of death that he knew. He would have laughed non-stop if it happened to any other player, but since he was the victim here, he could only weep in sorrow. No wonder the difficulty of Mage was listed as 10 stars on the official website of the game, which was the highest difficulty of all classes. Warlock and Priest, the other two classes of spellcasters, were only 5 stars. Roland recalled the notice he read before entering this virtual world. After a player died, they could be resurrected several seconds after their consciousness found a temple of the Church of Life and light on the ritual table. He observed the people who were busy next to his body. In this state of consciousness, he only had regular sight and could not smell, taste, or feel anything. He felt panicked and horrible when he stayed in this environment of sensory deprivation for too long. He hurried to climb on the ritual table and lie down. The stone skirt of the goddess skirt was before him again. Of course, there was nothing underneath the skirt except for simple stone structures. It was not fun at all. While Roland was having random thoughts, the goddess statue's eyes glowed a green that illuminated his consciousness. His consciousness turned warm, and strange energy flowed within. Then, he became dizzy. By the time he woke up again, he found himself lying on the ritual table. He stood up, only to discover that the NPCs who were busy moving the body stared at him in surprise with their mouths gaping. At this moment, he felt slightly cold. He lowered his head. Then, he couldn't have looked more awful. He was entirely naked, without the tiniest piece of cloth. Roland was so embarrassed that he would rather kill himself. Trying to remain calm, he glanced at the crowd and wondered how he could extricate himself from this awkward situation. But soon, he heaved a long sigh, because it was impossible for him to explain himself when he did not know the language. It had been proof that he couldn't activate language proficiency for now. At this moment, the old reverend said something to the crowd, and they left the temple in order. The last of them even closed the door. The temple became dim again. The headless body was still lying on the ground. The blood on the old reverend's face was gone, but brains still lingered on his clothes, which was rather creepy. Roland, however, was not scared, because the blood and gore had been thoughtfully blurred into harmless squares in the game. Chapter 3, Communication. One of them was a dying old man covered in blood, and the other was a naked, fresh young man. Roland had read plenty of books on religion, of course, mostly non-serious ones. He heard that some reverends liked boys best. Roland's character was only 17 years old. Was he a little boy in the old man's eyes? Thinking about that, he felt a toothache and became wary. He jumped backward. With the ritual table in between as an obstacle, he was more relaxed. Perhaps because the negative effect of resurrection had passed, Roland felt a lot more comfortable. He covered his genitals with one hand and gazed at the Reverend. He wouldn't have been scared of such an old man in reality because he could easily beat the old man up if he asked for trouble. However, he was in a highly simulative game, and the old man was a reverend of the Church of Life. Different from the fat reverends who were obsessed with boys in reality, the reverends in this game were capable of real spells. Seeing the young man's wariness, Falcon smiled at him. Maybe because he looked trustworthy, the young man seemed more or less relaxed. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Falcon raised his hand and pointed at the young man's forehead. Roland did not expect that the stranger would cast a spell without any warning. A green ball of light dashed at him, but it was not too fast. Roland hurried to dodge, but the light ball followed him and hit his head after a turn, before it transformed like jelly and leaked through his skull into his brain. Roland thought that the Reverend was trying to kill him. After all, it was not unusual for a player to be killed by an NPC. He expected more head-exploding agony, but to his surprise, he felt nothing except a twinge in his head. "Young man, you should be able to understand me now." It was not any language that Roland was aware of, but he could understand what the Reverend was saying now. Roland was briefly stunned, but he soon realized what was going on. Holding his forehead, he gasped and said, "Language proficiency? Mister, please wait a moment and let me put on my clothes first." Roland was certainly not a fan of nudity. He soon found the option, "Pick up your body," on the menu and clicked confirm. Roland's headless body turned into countless white cubes in a few seconds, which were stretched into a beautiful ribbon and flew back into Roland. The scattered brains and blood turned into flecks of light and also flew back to him. It was a beautiful view. Not just that, the temple was back to normal, and the stains on Falcon's clothes were entirely gone. The place changed from a gruesome slaughterhouse back into the peaceful chapel. Roland's consciousness received the system's reminder, "You've retrieved your body and recovered 50% of the experience that you lost after you died." The amount of recovered experience is 0. Because Roland's head exploded soon after he was born, he hadn't gained any experience yet. Naturally, none of it could be recovered. When the glistening cubes all returned to Roland, new clothes were added to him. They were exactly the clothes he wore at the beginning. Roland was much more poised with clothes on him. He nodded and said, "Mister, thank you for your trouble. How long can this language proficiency last?" "Around 3 hours," said Falcon weakly and hoarsely, like every old man. He was rather confident that the stranger was a golden son, according to the oracle. "When I was young, it could last more than 5 hours. Most old men cherished their feats when they were young. This old man, though a reverend and an NPC, was no exception." Roland secretly chuckled but said normally, "I am Roland." "What's your name, Señor?" "Falcon." After offering his name, Falcon eyed the young man up and down. Judging from his action and behavior, he did not seem to be a man of manners. Yet, he had an odd air around him that made Falcon feel that it was just the way he talked and he did not mean to be rude. Falcon was a reverend, a senior, and a former mercenary. For regular people, he was a high and mighty savior of the world. But essentially speaking, Falcon was only a human being who was slightly above average, and who had lost his source of intelligence after he settled down here. On many occasions, intelligence was not just intelligence, but also knowledge. Having lost the sources of intelligence and knowledge in this small town, Falcon knew very well that he barely made any progress in the past decades. If anything, he even retrograded. However, he did not regret it. Glorifying the goddess in this town was what he was most proud of in his life. The golden sun before him seemed approachable, but there was no telling what was on his mind. Logically, since he was revived on the ritual table for the goddess, he must be rather intimate with the goddess. "Mr. Roland, you must be a golden sun, no?" ventured Falcon prudently. He couldn't be more careful until he figured out the personality of this young man. "A few days ago, the goddess left an oracle which stated that you would arrive from the outer dimensions and live with us. Is that the role of the players in this game?" Roland found it curious. In most games, players were set as saviors or powerful, special persons. It was the first time that he had been treated as a foreigner. However, it did make sense on second thought. There couldn't be 500,000 saviors, could there? Roland nodded. I'm probably a golden sun that you mentioned, and I'm indeed from an outer dimension. Mister, can I ask you a question? Falcon smiled. By all means. Where am I? Roland looked around as he spoke. I know that this is a temple of the life goddess. What I would like to know is my current location. Falcon turned around and opened the door. The morning sunlight flowed into the temple like an orange brook, bright and warm. Basking in the sunlight as if there was a halo around him, the Reverend smiled at Roland. Welcome to Red Mountain Town. Chapter 4, Red Mountain Town. Following the old man, Roland walked out of the temple. The sun was not so dazzling in the morning, but he subconsciously closed his eyes when he was faced with it. A few moments later, Roland grew accustomed to the luminescence and opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was the pure and clean sky, which was not half as polluted as in modern society. Below the blue sky was a glistening lake on which there were several black leaf-like spots. Upon closer look, Roland discovered that they were tiny boats. Many buildings of different heights and colors were round the lake. Among the buildings were lines of villagers, marching along like ants. A huge bridge connected the two ends of the lake and divided it into two parts. Roland breathed the fresh air and listened to the whistle of the wind on the mountain top, feeling tranquilized. After a long time, he said to the old man, "This is Red Mountain Town? I think it should be called Lake Town." Falcon's eyebrows lowered, as if he were not in a good mood. "It's not a good name. Mr. Roland, what's your plan? Not a good name? Because it does not sound good, or for other reasons?" Roland was curious, but noticing that Falcon was not happy, he did not pursue further. Roland was truly impressed by the producer of this game who had made both the scenes and the NPCs so vivid. More importantly, the game accurately reproduced human senses, except for the sense of pain that was reduced to 1/10 as a protective measure. After all, if the pain of being hurt or killed was perfectly simulated, only masochistic players could have endured it. Roland considered the question for a while and then said uncertainly, "Travel and play, probably." Falcon looked at Roland in surprise, his narrowed eyes slightly widened. "Simple as that? Shouldn't you have lofty ideals such as saving the world, defeating demons, or slaying a dragon?" Roland smiled at Falcon's surprise and amusement. He said slowly, "I'm just an ordinary person. I don't know how you view the Golden Suns. That's what you call us, right? But most of us have come to this world for fun. Maybe our dreams will change later, but that is our purpose for now." Roland meant it. At first, he thought that he was to be given a quest. However, he found it impossible to regard Falcon, who felt so real, as a pure NPC. Roland was not an idiot. Talking to an NPC and talking to a real person were different. However, though Falcon was obviously an NPC, Roland had the feeling that he was talking to a real person. He didn't have to be serious in a conversation with such a gentle old man, but he should be at least sincere. Falcon looked at Roland, feeling strange. He had never seen a human being like Roland before, who had an undying body but whose biggest dream was to go sightseeing for fun. Other people who had such abilities would probably have great ambitions, not just fulfilling themselves but even conquering the world. The Golden Sun before him, however, only wanted to have fun? Nobody else would have believed it, because it didn't make sense, but Falcon did. He had seen a lot of people who were highly aggressive, but the person before him was as innocent as a baby. The dimension you're from must be free of war and carnage. Falcon looked at the young man and sighed. "Isn't it marvelous?" "Actually, it isn't." Roland shook his head helplessly. "But the country I'm from is rather safe. It's peaceful and prosperous. Occasionally, unbelievable things happen, but they're all far away from me." For Roland, it was a plain explanation, but for Falcon, it was pure bragging. His white robe moving under the cool morning breeze, Falcon heaved a long sigh and said, "If only I could live in your world." Roland looked at the old reverend with great interest. Thanks to his major in college, he had been in touch with the famous A.I. Although he had no chance to get to know AlphaGo, he was quite familiar with Siri. Siri did quite well in daily conversations and acted like a regular person. However, in the more in-depth conversations, including those about life, world events, or history, Siri was obviously not intelligent enough and would give rigid and mechanical replies. The old man before his eyes, however, was no different than a regular person when he was sad or envious in a conversation. Roland was not sure that Penguin Corporation could achieve that. Besides, according to the official website, there were more than 15 billion intelligent people living in this game world, and every NPC could compare to a real person. What technology had Penguin Corporation, which was famous for its counterfeit products, developed? Before he entered the game, Roland was never convinced of such propaganda, because every company tended to oversell their product. However, he believed it after meeting this old man named Falcon. He could imagine how spectacular this world could be if all the NPCs had a unique personality and soul. Real scenery and perfectly simulated NPCs. Roland felt the passion for games that he hadn't felt for a long time. He slapped his thigh hard and asked, "Mr. Falcon, how should I go to the nearest city from here?" Falcon was surprised. The young man, who had been calm so far, suddenly had strange enthusiasm. The guy's eyes were still clear, but there was now new light in them. "Go down the road on the west side. You will see Delphin in 4 hours if you're on foot." Falcon paused for a moment and continued, "You'd better not deviate from the main road on your way. There's a maple forest next to the road outside of Red Mountain Town. Many enormous spiders live in the forest. Normally, they don't come to our territory, but when they're too hungry, they might go crazy and hunt human beings." "Thank you, mister." Roland waved at Falcon and walked down the gray steps on the mountain road. The morning sun was as bright as an orange, and the breeze was as gentle as a veil. The noises of the town gradually found their way into Roland's ears. Roland was of a mind to open his arms and embrace the blue sky and the white clouds, but he was afraid that he would seem too silly. He simply pursed his lips and murmured, "Fallon, I'm here." Chapter 5, You Gotta Be Kidding Me. The journey from the mountaintop to the foot of the mountain took Roland only 10 minutes. Many people were waiting for him down there with smiles of amusement. Some of them were even gesturing to show the size and shape of a certain organ on Roland, raising the audience's chuckle. Roland's face was burning, but he pretended to be cool and passed them. He could feel their eyes on his back even though he was dozens of meters away. It was certainly not the best experience for a beginner of the game. If it had happened in reality, Roland would probably have to move to a different city, but since he was in a game, embarrassing as it might be, he felt a lot more relaxed when he remembered that they were all NPCs. However, those people's response was truly logical. As the game had claimed, every NPC was as intelligent as a real person. Roaming the street, Roland observed the busy folk around him. Some were walking in a hurry, some were peddling their wares, and some were carrying heavy bags for other people. All of them seemed to be ordinary people. All of them were dark-skinned and in linen clothes. Occasionally, younger women with fairer skin walked on the street. Compared to them, Roland was actually the strangest one. He was also wearing gray and brown linen clothes, but his skin was even fairer than that of any woman. It was obvious that he had never suffered. Therefore, other people stared at him anywhere he went. Ignoring people's judgmental eyes, Roland finally made it to the bridge. He had remembered the basic streets of this town when he was on the mountaintop, so he did not have to ask the way. The stone bridge was broad and straight. On its two sides was the glittering lake. When the damp wind over the lake touched his ears, he felt like he was flying. Roland couldn't help but gaze at the rippling lake that looked like a sapphire on top of the rail. He could see the whole lake from the mountaintop, but now that he was on the bridge, the lake seemed to be endless. On the boats far away, the fishermen were trawling while singing songs. From behind the bridge came 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. They were around 7, and each of them was carrying a basket. In patched clothes, The snotty children hopped to Roland's back. They pointed at Roland and laughed at the same time. At this moment, language proficiency was not over yet, and Roland could understand them. Mom says that he loves being naked. Grandpa says that there may be something wrong with his head. Dad says that he was trying to seduce a woman. What is seduce? Roland turned around and looked at the kids helplessly. Wow! The kids rushed to the other end of the bridge as if they were scared of him, before they grimaced at him gloatingly. His sightseeing mood was ruined by the kids. Roland brushed his hands together and went on. The three kids ran farther and farther away until they were nowhere to be seen. Donkey carts crossed the bridge now and then. Roland intended to hitchhike at first, but he soon gave up the idea. After all, the things, mostly feces and other strange items, on those carts were too disgusting. Across the bridge, Roland left the town and embarked on a village road. He could tell that the road was bumpy and ragged even though he was wearing shoes. Logically, since he was used to tarmac roads in cities, he should be exhausted after walking on such a shabby road for a while. Yet, oddly enough, he did not feel tired after walking for almost an hour. Perhaps it's because I'm a character in the game. Roland thought of the possibility. As Red Mountain Town was left far behind, it was quieter and quieter. Next to the road was a forest. Roland occasionally saw donkey carts when he left the town, but now all he could hear was the blowing leaves in the powerful wind. The strange chirps of unknown birds added to the emptiness of the forest. After Roland crossed a hill, the trees beside the road turned into maples. Nothing could be heard here except for the wind, not even bugs. Roland remembered that this was the habitat of giant spiders. How giant were those spiders? Roland was rather curious, but he gave up the idea of visiting them. His plan was to go to a city and look for other players. Also, transportation was more convenient in the city, and it should be easier to search for intelligence or jobs. He could stay in the city until he earned enough money to go to other cities after he reached out to his friends. It was already noon at this point. The sunlight was rather scorching. Roland sat down in the shade of a tree and decided to rest for a moment. Hardly had he sat down when he heard the vague, distant cries of little kids. Nobody was on the road, and the place was awfully quiet. Roland looked around and saw nothing but trees and colorful weeds. He chuckled and thought he was hallucinating now that he was in an empty, quiet environment by himself. It must be how ghost stories originated. Leaning against the tree, Roland fanned himself with his hand and listened to the howling wind, enjoying the peacefulness. However, he jumped up the next second and charged into the woods. It was because he heard another scream, which was still vague but sounded familiar. Then, he remembered that it was the voice of one of the three kids who made fun of him an hour ago, specifically, the girl, because her voice was very distinct. The three kids had been ahead of him. Giant spiders, little kids. Was it possible? The screams became clear soon after he rushed into the woods. It was not until he entered the woods that he noticed how dim it was below the trees. Rotten leaves were emitting stench everywhere. There were also white nets at the roots of many trees. At this moment, the kids were crying up ahead, nearby. Roland rushed. Unsteadily, he passed a dozen weird maples that were at least 2 meters in diameter, only to see the most chilling scene. The three kids were on the branch of a tall tree, and a huge spider was knocking the tree below them. After each collision, the tree would shake for a while, and the kids on top would shrill in fear. How big was this spider? It was at least 1.5 meters tall. Considering the length of its appendages, it was more than 2 meters wide. Shoot! Roland was an ordinary person in reality after all. His legs were trembling beyond his control when he saw such an unbelievable monster unexpectedly. Hi! This is Novel Admire. Thanks for the visit. Chapter 6, Gains and Losses. Roland had always been a fan of horror and mystery movies. He had also fantasized a lot what he would do when he encountered monsters or ghosts. In his fantasy, he was brave and determined. Even though he was badly wounded, he could still struggle to escape. However, when he was faced with a real monster, Roland realized that fantasy was just an ungrounded daydream that could easily be wrecked by the hammer called reality. Besides, what he was faced with was not exactly the hammer of reality. It was just a game. The spider did not see Roland. If Roland were to flee, he should be able to escape, but when he saw the three kids who were crying and trembling in fright, he found it impossible to turn tail and run. One can find 10,000 excuses to be weak, but one only requires a single reason to be brave. Roland squatted and found a rock and a broken branch. He twisted the front end of the branch to make it pointy. "I'm a player. This is a game. I don't need to be afraid," Roland murmured to himself. At this moment, the spider crashed into the tree again. Even though he was a dozen meters away, he saw the cracking bark of the tree and felt the earth tremble. The three kids on the tree were nearly thrown off, which made them even more scared. They screamed and shouted, tears and snot all over their faces. They couldn't have looked more wretched. He couldn't wait any more. Roland grabbed the rock and hurled it out. He roared, "Monster, check this out!" While Roland did not have great aim, the spider was too large for him to miss. The rock hit its body, causing a strange metallic noise, before it was deflected elsewhere. Sensing the attack from behind, the giant spider moved with its 8 legs and turned around quickly. Roland gasped at the abominable appearance of the spider. It had more than 100 red complex eyes on its head. Patients with trypophobia would have lost the courage to fight it. Even more horrifyingly, it had a pair of black sickles that extended from the 2 sides of its mouth. They were long and spiky, with thorns at the ends. It was not hard to imagine what terrible wounds the sickles could cause. It was a classic predator. Roland was of a mind to use magic. He remembered that, apart from language proficiency, he had 2 level 1 spells, namely Inferior Fireball and Hand of Magic, which he learned when he created the character. However, since his head might explode if he failed to cast the spell, Roland gave up the idea. If the would-be hero died first, there would be no hope for the 3 kids. The giant spider stared at Roland for a while. Then, it turned back and hit the tree again. Immediately, the 3 kids cried out. Roland couldn't hold back anymore. He took a deep breath and charged at the spider, which showed no reaction when he approached. Delighted, Roland raised his stick and bashed the joint on the rightmost leg of the spider. Roland learned that the spider's body was hard from his first attempt to throw a rock. So, Roland tried to attack the spider's joint this time. Based on his fundamental understanding of biology, the joints of most creatures were vulnerable. The stick hit the spider's joint heavily. Then, Roland discovered, to his surprise, that he seemed to be stronger than he thought. But as a spellcaster, he only had 5 points of strength. How strong would the warriors be when they had 10 points of strength at the beginning? Green body fluids spluttered when the giant spider's leg was hit. Then, the monster cried in shock and fury. It turned around quickly, and the black sickles on its mouth swooped at the enemy. Though Roland had prepared himself and jumped back the moment the spider turned around, his jump was not too long, because he was neither a warrior nor an agile class. The 2 black sickles penetrated his legs and nailed him to the ground. It was painful, but still bearable. After all, he could only sense 1/10 of the pain. The enormous spider knocked Roland down and dragged him back, leaving a long trail of blood on the ground behind him. Seeing that it had gotten its prey, the giant spider opened its mouth part slowly. Right then, Roland stuck the pointy end of his stick into the spider's mouth part brutally and shouted to the top of the tree, "Get down and run!" It was all that he could say, because the spiders had lifted him and smashed him twice, causing excruciating pain. He was too dizzy to say anything anymore. The 3 kids slipped down from the tree after a brief shock. The 2 boys cried and ran away, but the slim little girl picked up a stick, shaking but trying to help. Roland shouted angrily when he saw her, "Idiot, run!" The girl was dazed when Roland yelled at her. Then, she dropped the stick and ran away, weeping. Roland was rather comforted to watch her disappear. As a player, it was nothing for him to die once, but if the girl died, she would be gone for good. He remembered that, according to the game's promotion, All NPCs were unique. They would have their own lives. They would grow up and turn old. They would succeed and fail. Once they were dead, they would never respawn. Have I just saved a life? Roland was smiling when the enormous spider lifted him and smashed him again. After 5 times, Roland's consciousness was ejected out of his body. As a third party, he observed the spider tear his body apart, blood all over the ground. Yet, Roland was not pissed, because he knew very well that the spider couldn't live long. After all, the spider could not eat until it got rid of the pointy stick in its mouth part. Death was awaiting the spider. At this moment, an option popped up before his eyes: you're too far away from the nearest resurrection point. Do you want to leap to the nearest resurrection point? Roland chose yes. Chapter 7, Don't Be Picky. Roland was resurrected on the ritual table in the temple of the life goddess, naked once again, but he felt much more exhausted this time than the previous one. He opened the system menu, only to discover that he had a 2-hour weakness debuff. In a regular game, the debuff would have only resulted in the decline of attributes, and the player could wait it out. However, it was not the case in this game. At this moment, Roland did not feel like moving at all. He breathed hard on the ritual table, and he finally got off after he caught his breath. Nobody was in the temple. Roland wandered inside the temple, only to feel even more exhausted. He had to sit on a chair and take a rest. Soon, he fell asleep. After a long time, the gate of the temple opened, and Falcon came in with a set of white clothes. He was not surprised to see naked Roland again. Roland was woken up by the noise. He subconsciously covered his private parts, but he was relieved after discovering that it was Falcon. Falcon cast language proficiency at Roland and handed the clothes to him. Then he said, "Put it on, son." Roland took the clothes. It was a long robe, with bright blue stripes of light vaguely flowing on it. It was definitely extraordinary. He couldn't help but comment, "This must be a magic item." "Yes." Falcon smiled and said, "It was my suit when I was a mercenary. It can slightly improve the effects of spells. Though it's a magic item, it's not very valuable. I'm only keeping it as a memento. I can't accept this." Roland shook his head. Falcon smiled. "But you don't have any clothes, do you?" Roland realized that he had a point. So, he accepted the robe and put it on. It fit him perfectly. After he put on the clothes, he felt dizzy again and fell back to the chair. "What's wrong?" Falcon could tell that Roland was not well. "I'm weakened due to consecutive resurrections," said Roland bitterly. Falcon was silent for a moment, before he said, "Thank you for saving the kids." Roland said in surprise, "You already knew. Why else would I come here?" Falcon smiled. The 3 kids ran back in tears. Although their accounts didn't make a lot of sense, they managed to tell us how they were accidentally cornered by a giant spider and how you saved them only to get yourself killed. Roland found it odd. The territory of those spiders is not far away from Red Mountain Town. Why don't you try to remove them? There may be dire consequences if they break into the town. After a brief silence, Falcon said bitterly, "Those giant spiders are monsters. Ordinary people can't defeat them. Also, there are too many of them. Only professionals can kill them. But the problem is that I am the only professional in Red Mountain Town, and I'm better at healing than fighting." The old man seemed rather helpless. Actually, there were a dozen cases of giant spiders assaulting human beings every year, and most of the victims were children. Adults ran faster and could usually escape from the monsters, but little kids were not as lucky. If I could use magic, the battle wouldn't have been so hard. Roland was rather angry that he failed to crush the giant spider when he was capable of doing so. "Mister, can you teach me the tricks of magic?" Falcon stared at Roland for a while and smiled. He had the same determination when he was young, but his ambition couldn't make up for his aptitude, which was too humble. The young man, however, was different. He could tell that the guy was smart and had a decent education. "There are 3 types of spellcasters. I'm a priest, you're a mage, and there's also warlocks. I can't teach you sophisticated things, after all, I'm only a low-level professional myself, said Falcon slowly. However, I can teach you some of the basic knowledge. To cast a spell, a mage has to connect magic nodes. The faster you connect, the less time it will take for you to cast a spell. You can begin with the fundamental spells, so that your head will not explode due to magic recoil even though your attempts fail. Falcon pointed at his own head teasingly. Roland could only chuckle. After all, it was a rather embarrassing experience. You should go out and eat something. You can consider magic later. Falcon pointed at the gate and said, usually, people feel weak when they are hungry. Roland did feel like eating something. He was truly hungry. This game was quite real and had simulated the feeling of hunger. However, he smiled bitterly and said, I don't have any money. If our great hero starves, it will be a shame upon Red Mountain Town. Falcon helped Roland to his feet and dragged him out. To Roland's surprise, the old man was rather strong, although he seemed to be on the verge of death. After they left the temple, Roland discovered in shock that a small cottage had been established to the left of the temple. It was not spacious, but he saw a bed, cabinet, table, chairs and other furniture from the window. On the desk was hot food on wooden plates. A dozen people of different genders and ages were waiting on their way down the mountain. There were 3 kids who looked rather familiar. Roland recognized them and waved at them. Suddenly, all of the villagers bowed deeply at him. The 3 kids bent so hard that their heads almost hit the ground. Roland was somewhat stunned. Falcon patted Roland's back softly and said, You've earned this. They're all poor people who do not have much money. The only thing they can do to return your favor is to build a cottage and cook some food for you. Don't be picky. The sun was scorching at noon. Roland did not know how he should describe his complicated feelings. He tried to smile while holding back his tears. After paying tribute to him, the villagers left the mountain road. Falcon helped Roland inside the cottage and onto a chair, then took his leave. Roland gazed at the food on the table, which was still steaming hot. It was not until a long time later that he finally said helplessly, No chopsticks. I'm really not used to forks and knives. Chapter 8, Magic Modeling. Eventually, Roland managed to eat an uncomfortable lunch with a knife and a fork. Although he appreciated the villagers' gift, frankly speaking, the food did not taste very good. It was either overcooked or made with the wrong ingredients. Fried fish with mushrooms and steamed pheasant with tomatoes. Roland would have flipped the table if this was served in a real restaurant, but since he was in a game, he had to deal with it. Besides, the knife and the fork were made of wood. Their bluntness made it more difficult for Roland to enjoy the food. Actually, only magnates and nobles could afford iron knives and forks in this game. For even the plates were made of wood. It was not hard to imagine the poor life of the civilians in this world. The families of the 3 kids must have done their best to provide such an abundant meal for Roland. After lunch, the weakness debuff on Roland disappeared. Roland felt agile and energetic again. It was a strange feeling. When he was weak, everything seemed to be covered in a veil, but when the state of weakness was over, not only was the veil gone, but everything was also much brighter, as if a spotlight shone on the world. His mood was much better now that he was more comfortable. Roland observed the cottage that belonged to him now with great interest. The house had a coverage of about 30 square meters. Except for the supporting pillars which were made of wood, the whole house was made up of dry grasses. Even the floor had been piled with grasses. The dry grasses were gold and still had the smell of sunlight. Such a house would have been highly attractive to tourists in reality, but here, it was just a common cottage. The cabinet and the bed were simple. They were made of several planks and carried the unique smell of wooden products. Roland was grateful to the villagers. It would have taken him more than a day to build such a cottage, but the villagers had accomplished the task in only slightly more than an hour. Now that he had a place to crash, Roland was not in a hurry to go to the city anymore. He decided to stay here and find a job to feed himself first. He wouldn't go elsewhere until he familiarized himself with the 3 spells. Otherwise, he would be killed should he encounter a monster like a giant spider. Roland rested for a while on the bed. Then, he walked to the back of the church, ready to practice spells. He summoned Magic Book from the system and looked at the 3 built-in spells of his character. Inferior Fireball, Level 1 spell, Hand of Magic, Level 1 spell, Language Proficiency, Level 2 spell. Taking a deep breath, Roland began to activate Inferior Fireball. Same as when he used Language Proficiency, a weird circle with a lot of blue nodes popped up in his head. The starting node, which was bigger than the others, darted out a red line to another blue node. Just like the first time, the red line broke off after shaking for a while, except that the consequence was much milder and Roland's head did not explode this time. He was still as alive as could be, albeit with a minor headache. This game is too realistic. It's so challenging. Roland couldn't help but complain. How are mages going to make a living when it's so difficult to cast a spell? Although he grumbled, Roland tried another experiment once his headache was gone, only to fail again. Then, his attempt failed once more 10 minutes later. After repeating this more than 10 times, Roland's nose started bleeding. Yet, Roland covered his nose and chuckled. It was true that failure was the mother of success. Although Roland hadn't cast any spells successfully yet, he made unexpected discoveries. A bright halo suddenly appeared above Roland and enshrouded him, quickly alleviating the pain in his head. He turned back and saw Falcon walking in slowly. "Thanks." Roland waved at the old man. Falcon stared at Roland as he approached him. He seemed tranquil, but he was greatly shocked deep down in his heart. He could tell that Roland was smart and a natural-born spellcaster. However, the guy's potential was still beyond his imagination. Generally speaking, even the most excellent spellcasters had to rest for more than 3 days when they had 2 or 3 consecutive failed attempts to cast a spell, or their brains would have been wounded because of the pain. But how many times had this young man failed? At least 15, from what Falcon had seen. Yet, he still seemed vigorous despite the fact that his nose was bleeding. Were all the Golden Suns such monsters? Have you discovered anything? Falcon held back his surprise and questioned Roland in a low voice. "I know what magic is now." Roland extended his hand, and a bright transparent ball soon appeared in his hand. It looked rather beautiful. "Fiery magic power," Falcon mumbled, enviously and yearningly. Yet, the emotions were replaced by relief only a moment later. "Now that you've grasped the power of magic, it won't be long before you cast a spell." Roland, however, sighed. "There are too many nodes in the spell. I can't remember them even though I've learned how to use magic. Also, it seems that different nodes will result in different magic effects." His failed attempts had not only taught him how to use magic but also informed him of the relationship between the nodes. However, the problem was that there were too many nodes, and it was hard to control the flow of power, which made spellcasting all the more difficult. Falcon turned around and walked away, not intending to stay any longer. The last thing that a mediocre person would like to see was a rapidly growing genius, which would make the mediocre person jealous. According to the teaching of the Life Goddess, jealousy was a sin. Although Falcon had left, his voice still came from far away gloomily. "The beginner mages have to chant to cast a spell." Roland stiffened for a moment as if he were hit by lightning. Then, he was greatly enlightened. He picked up a stick and drew a profile of the nodes on the ground. He observed it intently for a while, before he numbered all the nodes. He was delighted at first but fell silent later. In the end, he became angry. He threw the wood stick away and cursed at the sky. "US city producers, isn't this mathematical modeling? Is this necessary? Do you have to make it so complicated? I just want to play a game. Why do you hate mages?" Chapter 9, Success. Roland's excitement was perfectly understandable. Everybody wanted to pick up new skills and play on easily in a game. But the difficulty of learning spells in this game was beyond his expectations. And this was only a level 1 spell. Level 2 spells could blow up his head if he failed. Roland remembered the chart of dense nodes when he used language proficiency a few hours ago and felt freaked out. What about the level 3, level 4, and level 5 spells? How many nodes did they require the spellcaster to learn and understand? Frustrated, Roland sat back on his bed. It was already sunset. His cottage was covered by the shadows of the trees on the mountain. When the trees swayed under the wind, the spots of light in the shadows sprayed across the ground. Roland looked at the beautiful view outside the window and listened to the wind and the birds. Nature was the best tranquilizer. Roland's mood became a lot better. He stood up and returned to the profiles with his stick. Since magic nodes would not move, he could establish a coordinate system to remember their locations. The beginner mages had to chant to cast a low-level spell. Roland speculated that the chanting would not increase magic power and was only a way to remember the flow among the magic nodes. Then, would it be better if he read the coordinates of the nodes out? Roland marked the coordinates of the magic nodes and thought hard. He established the most classic X, Y, and Z exercises with specific numbers. Of course, to accurately locate each node, Roland divided the 4 profiles equidistantly. It was already dark by the time he numbered all the nodes. He rested for a while in the cottage. He sniffed the leftovers from his lunch and discovered that they were not bad, so he ate again. He was rather hungry after an afternoon of hard thinking. When he was having supper, he did not notice that Falcon came to the 4 profiles he had drawn. The old man observed for a while and said in admiration, "What a detailed representation of the nodes of the magic model. Even though the spell analyzed is one of the lowest level, those 4 charts are still worth 10 gold coins. What a genius!" One Falcon roamed back to his temple with his hands clasped behind his back. He was a priest. He knew that magic models were valuable, but he was not interested. He was only here to check on Roland's progress. After eating supper in a hurry, Roland returned to the profiles. He recorded the 4 profiles and the nodes with the photo function of the system. After all, one's memory was always limited, but photos were different. If he extracted the photos from the virtual cabin to a portable disk, they could be forever preserved until he deleted them. If only the system had a modeling app. Roland mumbled and wrote the data on the memo of the system. Let's test this line first. X23, Y1, Z56. Z55, failed. Roland's head was painful. After he recovered, he recorded the reason for the failure on the memo. Node A and Node B cannot be connected. X23. Z47, failed. Reason: too many nodes were connected, the magic line broke off. 1 by 23. Z11, failed. Reason: nodes were connected too fast. X23. Z12, failed. Reason: Node C and Node D cannot be connected. X23. Z09, success. Watching a small, orange fireball the size of an egg slowly floating forward and disappearing after a crack, Roland clenched his fists and shouted in relief. But soon, he repressed his excitement and wrote down the successful line of notes on the memo with a note: "This can cast a small fireball, but it's too weak and slow to be applied in a real battle." Then, Roland tested more lines and had more successes than failures. Still, the small fireballs he cast were not satisfactory in terms of power and speed. Some of them were powerful and appeared blue, which suggested that their surface temperature was above 2000 degrees, but they were so slow that even kids could dodge them easily. Some others were fast but highly unsteady. They would take off for several meters after they were released. More and more lines were written down on his memo, and several important nodes were gradually highlighted. The mathematical model of inferior fireball had been preliminarily established. What needed to be done next was deduction and verification. Roland was certain that he could find the optimal line of nodes after a few more experiments. However, one could not be too optimistic. Accidents always happened with excessive optimism. It was a clear night with a bright moon when Roland tested spells behind the temple. Because his successful fireballs were generally small and couldn't fly far, Roland let down his guard and thought inferior fireball couldn't be too powerful. However, when he connected a new line of nodes, he realized that things were beyond his control. Roland felt that his magic power was extracted from him crazily and condensed quickly before his eyes. The previous fireballs were only as large as a fist at best, but this one was not only blue, but also bigger than a basin. It was probably inappropriate to call it a small fireball when it was so big. Roland's magic power was almost entirely supplied to this big fireball. It got rid of its creator's control the moment it took shape and darted right at the temple. Knowing that it was no good, Roland was about to shout a warning, when the fireball suddenly stopped. It expanded oddly 3 times, before it rapidly collapsed into a tiny point, unleashing astonishing brightness and an ear-splitting noise. The explosion was so loud that Roland was deafened. The dazzling light lasted only 1 second before infinite flames spewed out and swept across the area, accompanied by terrifying waves of air. Roland, who was at least 6 meters away from the site of the explosion, was flung away directly and did not hit the ground until he flew for 3 meters. He finally came to a stop when he rolled for another 5 meters. He felt that he had been hit by a heavy truck. His whole body, particularly his face, was burning. Even though the pain had been reduced to 1/10, he still felt that somebody had poured boiling oil on his cheeks. A tree 15 meters away from the explosion was nearly bent to the ground by the blast. Then, magic fire fell on a branch and ignited the tree into an enormous pillar of flame. Half of the back wall of the temple collapsed. The terrible explosion spread to Red Mountain Town at the foot of the mountain. Everybody was woken up by the rumbling sound. Cursing, yelling, crying, and barking, it was a complete mess. Chapter 10, that explains a lot. Many villagers hurriedly climbed the mountain with their torches to see what was going on. They were shocked by what they saw. Illuminated by a burning tree, the strange young man named Roland was lying on the ground, half dead, but he seemed to be grinning at the sky. His face was red and black, with plenty of blisters. Most of his hair had been burned. Around the young man were many bright blue flames, which were not dying out even though they were on sand. The villagers knew that the young man had saved 3 kids of the town. They were going to help, when Falcon stopped them and said, "Don't approach. The blue fire is magic and will consume everything it touches. You will be burned to ashes in 2 minutes if you step on it." Falcon was highly revered in Red Mountain Town. The villagers never questioned his authority. Intimidated by his warning, the villagers dared not move anymore. Falcon waved his hand and said, "There's nothing serious here. Go back and sleep. I'll ask for your help if need be." The villagers quickly dispersed. As ordinary people, they were naturally scared of things like magic or ghosts and were happy to keep a distance from them. Soon, Falcon was left alone on the site of the explosion. Gazing at the scattered bright blue flames, he did not press forward. Although he was a priest, he dared not underestimate the fire. In his eyes, every one of those flames could burn him to ashes, too. He focused his eyes on the young man who had been scorched but who was smiling happily. Sighing enviously, he waited quietly for 20 minutes until the bright blue flames died out when the magic sustaining them ran out. Then, Falcon approached Roland and cast healing and language proficiency at him. A bright pillar of light enveloped the young man and illuminated the environment. Was it worth it? Yes. Healing was not effective immediately but took some time. Yet, it was still faster than natural recovery. Roland's body was sore and weak, but since he could only feel 1/10 of the pain, it was not too uncomfortable. Hearing Falcon's question, he replied without any hesitation or complaint, "Unveiling the magic nodes feels like lifting the skirt of the goddess of fortune bit by bit. It's really thrilling." Cough, cough. Falcon coughed hard. Although he was a believer of the life goddess, he had respect for other deities. Roland's remark sounded like blasphemy in every way. He could only pretend that he did not hear it. But of course, if Roland had compared his experience to lifting the skirt of the life goddess, Falcon definitely wouldn't have reacted so peacefully. "Sorry for blowing up the wall of your temple." Lying on the ground, Roland looked up to Falcon, not because he liked to look up at other people, but because he was too weak to get back to his feet. "Rest assured, I'll definitely compensate for your loss, although I don't have much money right now. It's just a wall. The temple is already ragged. I've long planned to repair it." Falcon turned around and looked at the collapsed wall, his eyelids twitching. He was not regretful about the wall, but shocked at the power of the spell. He could tell that his temple was not the target of the attack but only accidentally involved, and still, a wall had collapsed. It was not hard to infer how powerful the spell just now was. Roland had learned to control magic in 2 hours, drawn the magic models in half a day, and could even strengthen a spell with a magic model now. Genius was not enough to describe him. His knowledge was unbelievable, and he was still so young. Roland was relieved to see that Falcon was not angry. After all, Falcon had helped him a lot. If he pissed off Falcon because of this, it would be too shameful. Roland made up his mind that he would find an empty place for his magic experiments next time. Falcon sat down next to Roland and said slowly, "Son, your body can't recover so fast. Why don't we chit-chat for a while?" "That's not a bad idea." Roland agreed to the proposal, because lying on the ground was too boring. "What are we going to talk about?" Looking at the moon in the sky, Falcon said, "Let's talk about your dimension." After a brief hesitation, Roland said, "I can't tell you much. We signed an agreement before we came here. We are not allowed to tell you the details of our dimension." At this moment, Roland did not know that there was not only an agreement but also systematic censorship. The names of special entities in reality would be identified and blocked, such as computers or phones. Falcon smiled and said, "What a shame. But I'm really curious about your world. Why don't I tell you about my adventures when I was young?" "I'm all ears." Roland did not know why Falcon was suddenly talking about his youth, but he was rather interested, partly because it could kill time, and partly because Falcon's experience might prove useful after he left this town. With the slow and steady voice of an old man, Falcon talked about his childhood, his first crush, his ambitions, his helplessness, his self-reconciliation, and his persistence. The scroll of his life unfolded before Roland's eyes. Everybody tended to be curious about someone else's life, and Roland was not an exception. While Falcon's life was not exactly remarkable, he had his own shining and interesting stories. One of them talked and the other listened. The night passed quickly, and soon enough it was already dawn. Thanks to healing, Roland recovered fast and was already able to sit up. Based on the speed of recovery, he would be healthy again soon. Just like that, I became a believer of the Life Goddess and came to Red Mountain Town. The sun had already half risen, radiating orange brightness from the east. Since the temple faced the east, it was now gilded by the morning sunlight. Falcon was about to stand up, when he suddenly stopped as if time was frozen. Roland was briefly stunned. Then, he realized that he couldn't move anymore, either. Not just them, the whole world consolidated and turned monochrome. The game is over for now. Please wait for the next opening. Reading the system notification in his vision, Roland exited the game, though he was not entirely satisfied yet. Hi. This is Novel Admire. Thanks for the visit. Chapter 11, Young Man, It's Your Foreskin. After a creak, the door of the virtual cabin opened, and Roland, who was in comfortable pajamas, lurched out. He patted his face and realized that he was wide awake. He didn't feel like he had gamed for a whole night. It did make sense on second thought. His body had been resting for the last 8 hours, and only his consciousness was in the game. So, his body in reality shouldn't be tired. He observed his silver virtual cabin, which was in the shape of an egg. Honestly speaking, he found it quite shabby. It was essentially an egg-shaped bed, with a few LED indicators and 2 magnet-like items near the pillow. Nothing else was worth mentioning. There were no nutrition fluids or neural connections as described in the science fiction novels. Yet, this cabin had successfully put him in a virtual world. Also, time flowed at a different speed in the game. 1 hour in reality equaled 3 hours in the game. The game was only available from 2200 hours to 6 o'clock the next day. The 8 hours in reality were a day in the game, which was why the game was frozen in the morning of the second day. The time was up in reality. It was a Saturday and he didn't need to go to work. Roland worked out on a treadmill for half an hour, then he took a shower and had some bread and water as breakfast. After that, he turned on the computer and opened the game's forum. As expected, the forum was exploding. In only an hour, more than 100,000 new topics had been added, and the number was still growing. Roland read some of the topics. Some of the netizens were impressed that the game was as immersive as it was claimed to be, and some found it hard to believe that Penguin Corporation, which was infamous for plagiarism, had developed such unbelievable technology. Roland had the same doubt. However, the fact remained undeniable: this was the first immersive game in the whole world. So, instead of questioning the source of Penguin Corporation's technology, he browsed on, only to laugh so hard that he was almost in tears. Many people were praising the game for a lot of aspects. Some believed that the NPCs were vivid, some complimented the beautiful environment, and some thought highly of the setting. However, one particular thread was stuck on the top, and it received as many likes as dislikes. According to this thread, players could hit on the NPCs in the game. The creator of this thread was a rarely seen bard, a variant of warlock with high charisma and built-in language proficiency, allowing him to understand what the NPC said. Roland found it unfair when he read this part. Why did the warlocks only need to read the name of a spell to cast it, when mages had to connect the magic notes? That was definitely occupational discrimination. However, as he read on patiently, he was soon amused. Taking advantage of his high charisma and language proficiency, this player hit on several young women when he joined the game. Then, he discovered, to his surprise, that he could have sex with the female NPCs in the game, which was certainly real and exhilarating. What happened next made Roland laugh. The two of them were caught by the woman's husband, and the husband surrounded the player with a dozen helpers. While the bard was a complex class with high combat abilities, he was now naked, unarmed, and his level was low. He was no match for the dozen brawny men. After he was defeated, he was pressed to the ground and circumcised by the husband with a knife. The blood was all over the ground. It was not very painful, but can you imagine the mental trauma when someone cuts your penis bit by bit with a sharp blade? I think I've been traumatized. All the replies in the thread were emojis of laughter. There are truly all kinds of players. Roland held his belly and laughed hard. Finally, he closed the thread and entered the feedback section. Naturally, there were not as many posts in the feedback section. Roland read some of them and realized that most of the suggestions did not make any sense. If the game was revised according to their wishes, it would be ruined. For example, someone proposed that the languages of all races in the game should be changed to Chinese so that the players could understand NPCs more easily. He pictured the blonde sorcerers chanting in Chinese and immediately found it unfitting. Roland read on and found some topics related to his own experience. A player had suggested that the difficulty for mages to cast a spell be lowered. All the other classes were capable of fighting, but not mages. Warriors had high strength, rogues were fast and could launch remote attacks, warlocks were natural-born sorcerers, and priests did not need to fight under the protection of warriors. All they had to do was cast healing. The poor mages, in comparison, were bad at melee battles and could not cast a spell. Their heads might even explode when they tried a spell beyond their level. The player was the chief of a guild. He wrote in his thread, "The level 2 spells, in particular, will result in head explosion whenever they fail. All the mages in my guild have head explosion experiences, some more than once. The girls are now almost traumatized. More importantly, no mages have successfully cast a spell yet. If you don't believe it, you can check the spellcaster section. Please, game designers, give us some hope." Roland felt a lot better knowing that his head was not the only one that had exploded. He left the feedback section for the spellcaster section. As he expected, the mage players were wailing there. They were complaining about how miserable and wretched they were when the magic recoiled. Head explosion was actually a neat way to die. The more appalling deaths included eyeballs popping and bleeding out. Although the pain in-game had been reduced to 1/10, it was still not a pleasant feeling. Roland read the section for a long time. Then he discovered, to his surprise, that no mages claimed that they had successfully cast a spell. Many warlocks, on the other hand, were gloating and encouraging the mages to delete their characters and become warlocks. "I can't allow this. Roland found a portable disc and connected it to the virtual cabin. He picked some segments of his experiments and posted them with the 4 profiles of spells in a thread titled Roland's Experience on Inferior Fireball. Chapter 12, Good Friend. Under the gentle light from the monitor, Roland typed on his mechanical keyboard quickly. Soon, he finished his article and uploaded the videos. After he posted them, he was going to rest his fingers for a while, when his phone rang. He glanced at the number on the screen and accepted the call. Without any formalities, he simply asked, "How's it going?" "Comment not bad. I'm already promoted to Saint Samurai," said a young man with a magnetic voice. "What about you?" "According to the forum, the future of mages doesn't look good." Roland replied, "It's fine. I've already got my feet under me." "You're good," said the young man sincerely. "You don't need to work today, do you? Let's meet at the old spot. I've called Raffle. This game is too complicated and astonishingly huge. It's hard to talk about it over the phone." "All right, I'll meet you there." Roland hung up the phone and found a t-shirt in the closet. Then he said goodbye to his parents in the living room and left on a bike. Roland was in a southern city, and it was a hot summer. The sun was scorching, although it was only morning. Roland tried to ride in the shadow of trees and avoid the sun, but he started sweating heavily very soon. The air in this city was usually humid, and there were few heavy industries within, with trees everywhere. So, Roland's hometown had great air quality and a clear sky. However, Roland felt that there was a strange smell in the air. He wondered if it was his imagination. 10 minutes later, Roland came to a cold drink bar. The official hour of opening had not arrived yet, but the door was already open. Roland secured his bike and walked in. The air conditioner was on in the cold drink bar. The moment he came in, Roland felt that he was revived from the heat. The decorations of the bar were mostly in warm yellow. He greeted the pretty woman at the counter and went straight to a booth on the second floor that had the plate of a pendant on the door. Soft music was being played inside the booth. A young man was sitting on the yellow chair. He was handsome, with fair skin, dark eyes, red lips, and bright teeth. He was enjoying a bottle of Red Bull, a watermelon before him. Roland sat down on his opposite and chuckled. "Red Bull and watermelon. You're having such aphrodisiacs so early in the morning? Did you have too much sex last night?" The handsome young man was named Chuck. They were best buddies and neighbors and had been in the same school from elementary school to college. They were not brothers but closer than brothers. So, they were most direct with each other. Chuck put down the can in his hand and said helplessly, "I have no choice. Marriage is the tomb of love. Now, all the sex is compulsory. If I hadn't worked hard to feed her first, I wouldn't have been able to join the game in time." Handsome guys were always pursued by a lot of girls. Chuck was good looking even compared to superstars. Besides, he was a decent man who didn't smoke or drink. Playing games was his only hobby. So, many girls were after him. Chuck's wife was his classmate, and naturally, Roland's classmate too, from middle school. Her name was Chen Hongdan. Of all his pursuers, she was the most beautiful and audacious. She had been pursuing Chuck since middle school. She even threatened her family so she could be sent to Chuck's class in high school. She also applied for the same college that Chuck went to and volunteered to do laundry for Chuck in college. After they graduated, they naturally got married. Chuck was the owner of this cold drink bar, but Chen Hongdan was actually running it. She loved her husband and did not want him to work hard. The Panda booth was a special place reserved for him and his friends. It was never open to the public. "You're talking like married life is hard." Roland knew that Chuck's life was comfortable. The guy had an easy job. He was not earning plenty of money with his cold drink bar, but his life was definitely above average. Besides, his wife was very nice to him. Most men would envy him. According to the official announcement, Saint Samurai is one of the 3 op classes. "How were you promoted so fast?" Chuck replied, equally puzzled, "At first, I thought it was hard. My character was a bard. I ran to the Temple of Light and prayed before the statue of the goddess with language proficiency, and then I was promoted. I found it odd, too. How does the class feel? Asked Roland curiously. Chuck picked up a piece of melon and said, I haven't fought anyone yet, but the privileges are quite good. People in the Temple of Light were shocked when I became a Saint Samurai. They offered me weapons and armors and 20 gold coins, claiming that they would give me money regularly every month. Roland sighed helplessly. Their experiences were too different. He had worked hard yet couldn't really cast one complete spell, and his friend was already making money. Most upsetting of all, Chuck didn't really do anything. How lucky was he? While Roland was bummed out, the booth opened, and two young men, one fat and the other slim, came in. They wiped their sweat and sat on the long chair without greeting Roland and Chuck. They didn't start talking until they had some watermelon. Today is too hot. I feel that my fat is being squeezed out. It was the fatty, who was named Raphael, who said this. He was not too tall and had an amusingly round face. It's because you're too fat. I don't sweat as much at all. The slim guy replied to him. He was about 1.83 meters tall. Because he was too slim, he looked like a pole. He was called Brazil, because he loved watching the Brazilian national team play football and wore their uniform all the time. He went by the same name in the game. Roland looked out and asked, Where are Leland and Husserit? Chuck waved his hand and said, They're working and won't be free until nighttime. Let's talk first. Tell me your locations in the game. Raphael and Brazil both shook their heads, because they could not speak the local language. Raphael was a shield warrior, and Brazil was an archer. Neither of them could cast a spell, so they did not know what the NPCs talked about. All they knew was that they were in different towns. Chuck said, I am in a city named Isnes. I don't know its specific location yet, but it should be a fairly large city with its scale. Roland told his friends his location, Red Mountain Town. Then he remarked, This game is outrageously huge. It seems that we are scattered. So, we might as well work on our own for now and make other plans later when we're more familiar with the game. Chuck nodded and said, That's all we can do for now. Chapter 13, Unexpected Earnings. The four of them chit-chatted in the cold drink bar for 3 hours and dispersed at noon. Roland rode his bike back home against the scorching sun in the middle of the day. The first thing he did after he came home was set the temperature of the air conditioner to minimum and let the cold wind blow at him. After he cooled down, Roland turned on his computer and logged in on the forum again, only to discover that his personal mailbox was filled with private messages. Roland was puzzled to see the ocean of notifications. Taking a deep breath, he read them more carefully. Most of them were tipping notifications. At first he thought it was a system error, but after checking a few messages, he discovered that he had indeed been tipped, some with 1 forum coin and some with dozens. On this forum, the forum coin equaled to money in reality. Every forum coin was about $1. All the tips were from the same source, Roland's experience on Inferior Fireball, which he posted not long ago. He reopened the Spellcaster section and saw that his thread was stick-eyed, highlighted, and recommended. He clicked the thread, and everybody was praising him. I admire nobody but the author of this post. These 2 forum coins are my gratitude. Analyzing spells with mathematical models is truly genius. I've memorized your self-detonation nodes in your last attempt and will try it tonight. Here are 5 forum coins. Inferior Fireball turns into a self-destructing bomb. You're definitely a promising bomber. I don't have much money, but here are 2 forum coins to show my support. There were a lot of similar praises. The tips ranged from 1 to 20. Of course, most people did not tip and were only here for fun. Some warlocks came in and tried to derail the topic, but their sarcastic remarks did not raise much attention and were soon drowned by the praises. Roland returned to the account center. He held his forehead after a quick glance, because he had more than 50,000 forum coins and the number was growing. Exchanging those coins into real cash, he would earn about $50,000 even with the commission charge. That was his salary for a whole year, and he had spent it on the game cabin. Little did he expect that he could earn the money for the game cabin back by posting his experience in the game. It meant that thousands of people had tipped him on the form. Those who could afford a game cabin were generally not poor. After all, the game cabin, which cost $50,000, was not cheap. Roland was happy to make some money, but he had a lot of complicated feelings after the incident. He was not a professional player, and he never thought to make a living by playing games. He exchanged the forum coins and soon received the money. Reading the text message that informed him of the payment of $50,000, Roland chuckled and had lunch downstairs. Then, he rode his bike for a while, and when he was back, he was calm again. The excitement of his bonus was gone. He played other games for a while, but after experiencing the immersive world, he had lost interest in other games. Even his favorite games couldn't appeal to him right now. Time had never moved more slowly for him. Finally, it was around 21:45. He put on his pajamas and crawled into the game cabin. The cabin was automatically closed, and a green light glimmered before his eyes. He closed his eyes and soon fell asleep. When he was awake again, he found himself back in the game. The world was still monochrome, and Falcon was still rising next to him. Roland could not move, either. He waited patiently. Soon, the world was colorful again, and Falcon stood up. He had no idea that Roland had left this world once. Hunched, he slowly turned around and said to Roland, "You can't be familiarized with magic overnight. I suggest you find a job in the town and save some money first. By the time you grasp the spells, you will have saved enough money for you to make other plans." 3. Roland realized that it did make sense, but he shook his head after thinking for a while. "I can't speak your language yet. I don't think I can find a job, can I?" "I got a job for you," said Falcon with a smile. "There's a mine at the back of the mountain. All you need to do is dig for minerals. No conversation is needed. There's free food, and the pay is decent." Mining was indeed a good way to grow rich in other games, but it was hard to say in this one. However, since Roland did not really have a choice, he eventually nodded and said, "Thank you, but I'm afraid that I don't have enough strength. Mining is hard labor, after all. Professionals are far stronger than regular people." Falcon smiled. "Even the spellcasters are much better than regular men in terms of body build. I could knock down a couple of brawny men barehandedly when I was young." Roland was not convinced, but he could tell that he was a lot stronger in this game than he was in reality, although he was merely a spellcaster. Falcon led Roland to the town. When they passed the trail next to the lake, a lot of villagers greeted Falcon, and Falcon greeted back politely. Roland could tell that Falcon was very popular here. 10 minutes later, Falcon brought Roland to the foot of a hill to the west of the lake. There was a cave here, with turquoise stones heaped outside. Further away lay a big stone house that was probably a warehouse. A dark middle-aged man was taking a nap on a desk outside of the warehouse. Falcon walked over and tapped the old wooden desk. The middle-aged man was immediately woken up. Seeing that it was Falcon, he said fawningly, "Master Falcon, what has brought you here?" "Galen, I've brought a worker for you." Falcon patted Roland's back and said, "He's a rookie, but I'm sure he won't disappoint you." The middle-aged named Galen sized up Roland for a while and hesitated. "Master, this youngster seems too soft and civilized for heavy-duty work." Falcon sniffed and mocked, "You think he'll work here for long? Also, you don't know who he is? You haven't been to the town recently, have you?" Red Mountain Town was not a large place. Most news spread throughout the town very quickly. It was rather strange that Galen did not know of Roland. The middle-aged shook his head. "I came from Roundwood Town this morning. It was exhausting and I've been napping since. I overheard that something happened in the town, but I don't know the details." Chapter 14, Purity 5. Galen was the richest guy in the town for a simple reason: his father was the mayor of the town, and he owned a mine. While the minerals were not very profitable, they still made Galen's life comfortable. Galen eyed Roland up and down. In the end, for Falcon's sake, he said, "All right, Since Master Falcon has recommended you, I'll take you on. However, I'm a fair man. I'll give him money according to the minerals he digs without any special privilege. How does it sound?" Falcon chuckled and said, "No problem." Then, he patted Roland's shoulder and left slowly. Galen opened the gate of the stone house, and the stench of rocks was unleashed. Different minerals had been piled up inside the warehouse. Galen fetched a hoe and a basket from inside and tossed them to Roland. He said, "These are your tools. You can start working." "Right, what's your name?" "I need to register it." Galen picked up a quill and opened a book from his drawer carefully. "Speak, and tell me your age, too." "Roland, 17. Roland was 24 in reality, but his game character was set to be 17, between a teenager and an adult. So, he could only give such information. After all, he looked too young to be 24, and Galen wouldn't have been convinced if he said so. Galen wrote down his name in the book. Roland stole a glimpse at it and discovered that the words in this world were pictograms. The words were not straight. There was no telling whether it was the standard format or Galen's personal style. In the end, Galen waved at Roland, and Roland strode into the cave with the hoe and the basket. The cave was rather huge, which was understandable because fresh air was needed in the mines. An oil lamp was established every dozen meters on the way. The wall was wet, and Roland could feel water on it. Roland dragged the basket forward. There were pit holes and pebbles everywhere on the way. After several minutes, he finally heard noises up ahead. Soon, he saw several people working hard at the end of the cave in different directions. This was the real mine. It was a rather spacious place. The dome was a dozen meters high, and there were about 30 meters from the left end to the right end. The place was rather dim despite the lamps hanging on the wall. Roland jumped off from the platform. Someone noticed the noise but soon focused on their mining. Time was money for the miners. Observing the environment carefully, Roland came to an unoccupied corner and watched other miners work. Then, he copied them. "Mining and sweating for an entire day, and copper of purity 5 is all I can find." To the soundtrack of Clink Cling Clings, Roland somehow remembered the poem. When MRP games were popular, he was only a 10-year-old child. He saved his breakfast money for a whole month to buy the monthly card for a game. Then, he mined 2 hours every day and paid for the game with the coins he earned in the game in order to play on. His deepest impression on the first MRP game was mining, and he was mining again in the first immersive game in the world. He wondered if he was destined to be a miner. Mining was an arduous task, but players, including spellcasters like Roland, had much better body builds than regular people did. When he started to work, his hoe was always hitting the hard rocks or getting stuck in the crevices, but half an hour later, Roland felt that he was getting the hang of it. A yellow and white rock was dug out. Roland picked it up and observed it for a moment. Then, he shook his head, threw it away, and worked on. Before, when Galen opened the warehouse, he had snapped the minerals in the warehouse with the photo function of the system, which allowed him to compare the rocks he dug out to the existing ones to evaluate their value. Of course, the comparison couldn't be accurate, but it was much better than random guesses. After another hour, the other miners sat down and rested, but Roland kept working. Those miners gathered and pointed at him. There was even vague laughter. They must be mocking Roland because they thought that Roland couldn't persist much longer. Roland ignored them and carried on. He had to keep trying until he felt exhausted. Those miners rested for a while and went back to work. An hour later, they were too tired to work on again, yet Roland was still waving his hoe. This time, they didn't tease Roland and just gazed at him in silence. After resting for a while, they continued digging, but when they gathered again and rested an hour later, Roland was still waving his hoe. The miners stared at the thin young man in disbelief. Someone couldn't hold back anymore and approached Roland. He looked at the rocks in Roland's basket and the dent on the wall that Roland had just created with complicated feelings. Roland pried a stone off the wall and threw it back into the basket. He smiled at the miner who approached him and left the mine with the heavy basket. At this moment, Language proficiency was already over. It was impossible for him to communicate with others. The miners watched him leave. Looking at their baskets that were still half empty, they all lost motivation to work. Roland left the cave with the basket. It took him quite a while to become used to the dazzling sunlight outside. In the end, he dragged the basket to Galen and heaved it onto Galen's desk. The basket was so heavy that the desk almost collapsed. Galen was greatly surprised and woke up from his dream. He exclaimed after he saw the basket and Roland behind it. However, Roland couldn't understand him now. After Galen made a long speech, he could only shrug helplessly. Sorry, language proficiency is over. Galen was stunned, because he couldn't understand Roland, either. However, as a merchant who traveled a lot, he guessed what had happened. There were more things that he wanted to say, but he could only shut up now. He moved the basket down to the ground and screened the rocks in the basket. The worthless ones were thrown away, and the valuable ones were divided into 3 heaps according to their quality. In the end, he counted them and put 28 coins on the desk. Roland took the coins and left without saying anything. Chapter 15, Quest? It was already noon. Everything seemed to be melting under the scorching sun. Trees and houses further down the road were slightly distorted by the hot air. Roland returned to the temple on the mountain along the trail. He saw that Falcon was treating a plump woman. Surrounded by a white pillar of light, the woman laughed in relief a few seconds later and soon left quickly. After it was done, Falcon cast language proficiency at Roland before he asked, "How much have you earned?" 28 coppers. Roland took out a coin from his pocket and asked, "This is copper, right?" With his hands on his back, Falcon approached him and smiled. "You earned more than I expected. I thought you could make no more than 10 coppers as a beginner. 28 coppers are enough to keep you full for several days." Roland smiled but did not explain. He said, "Where can I have food in town? I'm a little bit hungry." "Take a right turn down the mountain and walk along the trail. You'll find a tavern on your right after you pass up here. The food in the tavern is abundant and cheap, but of course, I wouldn't say it's delicious. I don't know if it agrees with you." "Any food agrees with me right now." Roland shrugged and left the temple after thanking Falcon. According to Falcon's instructions, Roland found the tavern under the scorching sun. There were 3 pictograms on the door of the tavern. Language proficiency could only influence the mind and allow people to talk with each other, it could not enable the recipients to understand written words. The tavern was not very large, with a coverage of no more than 200 square meters. The door was a short wooden one, making it possible to see what was going on inside from outside. There were several old but clean round tables, surrounded by round chairs. The fragrance of bread and the smell of sour alcohol spread everywhere. Roland also saw several men chugging big gray cups and clamoring as if they were drunk. Roland pushed the door and walked in. The waitress, who had been standing at the counter, immediately called earnestly, "Sir, welcome to Lakeview Tavern. What would you like to order?" So, the 3 words on the door meant Lakeview Tavern. While the waitress gazed at him in surprise, Roland backed off to the door and took a photo of the 4 pictograms, before he put a note of their meaning on the photo. Although language proficiency could not teach him a language instantly, he was able to learn the language if he used the spell in a roundabout way. Also, the spell seemed applicable to all languages, which made it quite useful. Roland was rather happy to realize the trick. He entered the tavern again, only to notice that the waitress was eyeing him strangely. He knew that his odd behavior just now must have surprised her. "Do you have anything cheap and delicious?" Roland sat on a chair before the counter and asked with a smile, "Don't recommend anything too expensive. I don't have a lot of money." The waitress was not exactly beautiful, but she was young and lovely, with freckles on the sides of her nose. Her eyes were big and blue, and her smile was sweet and comforting. "I recommend honey bread." The waitress was also wearing linen clothes, except that hers were cleaner and more fashionable. "I know you are the hero who saved 3 kids. I would have sold honey bread to you at half price if I were the owner of this tavern." "A piece of honey bread it is, then." "All right, Please wait a moment. The waitress went to the kitchen and soon returned with a plate that had a piece of long bread covered in golden honey. This is the bread you ordered. 2 coppers. The honey bread looked pretty huge. 2 coppers was a fair price, at least for Roland. He handed over 2 coppers. Then, the waitress stared at his hands in a strange way. Roland looked at his own hands, only to discover a couple of huge, appalling blisters there. He pressed them but felt no pain, although they seemed scary. It must be because the feeling of pain had been reduced to 1/10. It was the result of mining, but it didn't matter since it was not too painful. He could continue digging and making money tomorrow morning. Roland had a bite of the bread. Then, his expression changed subtly. The honey was good, and the bread was also good, but the honey bread was not exactly tasteful. It was too hard and even had an inexplicable smell. No wonder Falcon said that the food in this tavern might not agree with him. The waitress could tell what was going on from his subtle expression. She smiled. It's not delicious. But our bread is the best in this town, although it may be shabby for big shots like you. Big shots? He's just a brat. One of the few men who were drinking turned around and shouted, flushing, he has no advantages except for his pretty face. It was only because of luck that he saved those kids. I could have done the same. Why do you think so highly of him? Roland knew that he was probably famous in the town, but he did not know that he was very famous. Children were the future of a family, a town, and a country. Offspring always mattered most in every place. Saving a child could earn more gratitude than saving an adult on many occasions. Of course, while some people admired heroes and extraordinary figures, some people did not see eye to eye with them. Most of the time, their hostility boiled down to one simple reason: jealousy. Roland looked at the 3 drunkards, only to discover that there was nothing worth mentioning about them. They were all middle-aged men without any attractive qualities. Have I triggered a certain quest? Roland thought for a moment. In the spirit of experimentation, he said provocatively, cut the crap. Do you want to fight outside? The few men tossed their cups to the floor, splashing bright yellow ale everywhere. While the waitress screamed, they flipped over the table and walked toward Roland aggressively. Hi. This is Novel Admire. Thanks for the visit. Chapter 16, Upgraded. The alcoholics and Roland left the tavern. The waitress peeped from the tavern, but she dared not go out and stop them. She heard noises and screams, and soon, Roland returned to the tavern to finish the remaining bread with dark circles around his eyes. The waitress knew that Roland must have won, but she still chuckled at Roland's new look. Roland was slightly bummed. He did not receive a system notification telling him that he had claimed or accomplished a quest. It meant that the fight was not part of a quest. He felt that the test was not worth it. Although he did defeat a few drunkards, his own face was punched several times. It was not very painful, but the bruises on his face made him look rather hilarious. Roland finished the honey bread and paid another copper for a cup of honey juice. Then, burping in satisfaction, he reached the east side of the lake, walking along the trail next to the lake. This place was at the foot of the mountain and would be overshadowed by the mountain in the afternoon. Due to the cold and lack of sunlight, no villagers had built their houses here. So the place was empty. Roland found it a perfect place to practice magic. He redrew the profiles of the nodes of inferior fireball on the sand, before he analyzed and reversely inferred them. The mathematical model was obviously helpful right now. He could have results as long as there was enough data. Math was a compulsory class in college. Roland was not adept at it, but he had passed it anyway. He calculated for a long time and found 3 excellent roots of nodes, which featured speed, power, and distance respectively while guaranteeing the stability of the spell. After he tested the 3 node roots, surprisingly, he received a system notification. He had leveled up. No glittering special effects, and no pleasant background music. He had leveled up simply and unexpectedly as that. Roland also noticed that the icon of inferior fireball on magic book in the system now had a bright gold background and verse behind it. Studying a spell could increase the experience of the game character? That could be the only explanation. Such a way of leveling up was indeed fit for scholar-type classes such as mages. Roland found the game more and more interesting. The system only offered simple notifications. There were no hints of quests, mini-maps, or character profiles. Players could only see the initial attributes of their characters when the characters were built. There were no health bars or names above the NPCs' heads, either. Everything felt real. After the level up, Roland felt that he was slightly stronger and more flexible. But more importantly, he could sense the flow of magic in his body more clearly. He had to cast spells consecutively to sense magic previously, but right now, he could clearly sense a comforting matter in the air, which was being absorbed into his body slowly. That must be the elements of magic power. What really amazed Roland was another system notification: "Dear player, you have reached level 1 and become an official professional. The backpack function of the system has been activated. You can use this function by reading Backpack in your heart. Please find out the effects of this function on your own. Have fun." So, the system offered a backpack. Roland clapped his hands in great delight. It was the first time he had played an immersive game, but anybody with common sense about games should know how convenient it would be to have a backpack that did not need to be carried in such a lifelike game. Roland soon opened the backpack according to the instructions. A translucent cubic space was unfolded before his eyes. Though it was right next to him, Roland knew that it was a projection that only he could see. The storage of this backpack was 8 cubic meters. "It's so huge." Roland threw some stones and sand into the backpack, before he added twigs and water. Soon, he reached a useful conclusion. Gravity did not exist in the backpack, which made it easier to heap items. After all, nothing would collapse if there was no gravity. As to whether or not the backpack could preserve food, and for how long? That required more tests to figure out. Roland looked around. Then, he chanted the magic coordinates very quickly. X23. Z88. It was the optimal route of nodes for inferior fireball that Roland had found out through mathematical modeling. Comprehensively speaking, it had the best performance in terms of speed, power, distance, and stability. The bright blue fireball the size of a fist dashed into the water in the lake. A few bubbles immediately popped up. Soon, 3 little fish floated to the surface. Roland lifted his robe and entered the water. He threw the 3 silver fish into his backpack. Those fish were stunned but still alive, but they struggled and stopped moving after they were thrown into the backpack. They were obviously dead. The backpack could not keep living creatures. Roland recorded it on his memo pad. He couldn't test the preservation abilities of the backpack for now, but he was sure that he could find out in a day or 2. Now that he was versed in inferior fireball, his level had increased, and he even got an unexpected backpack. Roland focused his attention on another level 1 spell, Hand of Magic. It was a control spell without much damage. According to its description, the spell could form an invisible hand with magic to grab objects. The size of the hand, the gripping power, and the reaching distance were related to the level of the mage, the connection of nodes, and the amount of magic power. Then, there were consecutive failures again. However, perhaps because he had upgraded and had a better perception of magic, he did not feel as tired and painful as he did when inferior fireball failed. Therefore, Roland was soon able to draw the profiles of the nodes of Hand of Magic. It was much faster than when he analyzed inferior fireball. Then, he bought more bread at Lakeview Tavern, partly as supper and partly as a nighttime snack, and tossed it into his backpack in the evening. He also bought a lamp in the tavern. After that, he spent the whole night establishing a mathematical model for Hand of Magic. Finally, when it was dawn, Roland found out the optimal route of nodes for Hand of Magic 10 minutes before the game paused again. Hand of Magic on the magic book was now versed, but Roland's level did not increase this time. He estimated that it was because the experience required for the next level up had increased, so grasping another spell was not enough for him to level up again. Chapter 17, New Spell. Roland bought a piece of freshly made honey bread in Lakeview Tavern. He was about to eat it, when the game world paused and turned monochrome. 24 hours had flown away so quickly. Roland sighed and exited the game. It had been years since he was so addicted to a game. Most games on the market today were too similar. He grew bored of every new game after playing it for several days, even though they were all AAA games, because he always felt that he had somehow played them before. However, World of Fallon was different. It was the first immersive MMORPG worldwide. By casting their consciousness away from reality, the players were able to have adventures in an alternate world under a different identity. A world so broad that one might not be able to see the whole of it in their entire life, billions of lifelike NPCs, and 100 countries of different races. Roland was excited by the thought of it. He felt lucky that he made up his mind to buy a game cabin. There were only 500,000 of them worldwide. People who missed the purchase window had to wait for a long time before Penguin Corporation released the next batch. After he exited the game, Roland worked out on a treadmill for half an hour as usual. He then had breakfast and checked the forum again. As he expected, many people were encouraging Penguin Corporation to sell the next batch of virtual cabins. Some were even offering to pay 10,000 more bucks to buy a second-hand virtual cabin. After reading a few random threads, Roland went to the spellcaster section and posted the profiles of Hand of Magic and several interesting notes. He also announced that players would receive a backpack when they leveled up. After that, he browsed through other threads. He never thought that he was the smartest player in the game. After all, many people knew mathematical models. It was just that a lot of mages, who were highly intelligent in reality, never thought about that before. Now that Roland had opened a door for them, they could certainly walk through it. As Roland had expected, new threads on spells appeared in the section. One particular thread drew his interest. As long as you remember the notes of a spell and successfully cast it once, you will be able to learn it. I'm a mage specializing in enchantment, and I only know hypnosis, animal control, and mind influence. I learned the chart of notes for Inferior Fireball on the forum by heart. After dozens of failures, I successfully cast Inferior Fireball, and the icon of Inferior Fireball appeared in my magic book. It's evident that spells can be learned. I've managed to record the notes of hypnosis and posted them here for you. In the end, respect to Roland the Pioneer. The Pioneer. Roland felt rather embarrassed. He tipped the female player named Serena 10 forum coins, before he copied the 4 charts of hypnosis down. He then copied the charts provided by another 3 mage players on the forum. Of course, he did not forget to tip them 10 forum coins each. Now, he had 4 new charts of magic nodes. All of them were level 1 spells, namely Hypnosis, Strengthening, Ice Ring, and Arcane Bullet. Roland copied the profiles of the 4 spells into his game cabin with a flash disk. Then, he realized that his new post had received thousands of bucks worth in tips. Looking at his forum coins, he had never thought that making money could be so easy. After that, he left home on a bike and hung around with his friends in the cold drink bar. When the night came, he crawled into the virtual cabin again and entered the game. In the game world in the following days, Roland mined in the morning and studied new spells with the profiles of spells he obtained from the forum in the afternoon and at night. It was not until he had real practice that Roland learned how difficult it was to pick up a new spell. Unlike the existing spells in the magic book, which would automatically generate a 3D graph of the magic nodes in his consciousness, the new spells offered nothing. Roland had to construct a space of magic nodes with his magic power on his own, before he correctly filled the magic nodes in with his mind. Constructing the models of magic nodes with the charts he copied alone had taken Roland a lot of time. The chart of every spell required more than 10 hours and a dozen failures. It was not until he learned the new spells that their icons would appear in the magic book. Then, to be versed in the new spells, Roland still had to test and infer the effects of the magic nodes. After several days, 4 bright gold icons appeared in Roland's magic book. After grasping the 4 spells, Roland reached level 2, but he was not very happy, because he realized that there would be fewer and fewer mages in the future. Life for a mage was too hard. Learning a new spell required a good sense of space, understanding of math and logic, and tremendous patience. Roland knew that a lot of people in the game must be smarter than him, but not all of them were mages. After all, there were many classes in this game, and different people had different preferences. There must be a lot of mages who were weaker than him in terms of comprehensive abilities. They would run out of patience if it took days or even weeks for them to learn a spell. Some of them might not be able to learn new spells at all due to lack of spatial awareness or logical thinking. Even if they managed to grasp level 1 spells, there were still spells of higher levels and difficulties. Would they have the patience to learn such spells? When they noticed that warlocks and priests could wield powerful spells with a simple chant without having to memorize it, and that new spells automatically appeared when their levels increased, the mages would be even more dissatisfied and would even complain. Then, they would demand the game producers reduce the difficulty of mages on the form. However, Roland did not think that their attempt would work. After another day in the game, when Roland left the game and opened the form, he realized that the spellcaster section was indeed a mess. Many mages had posted that if the game producers did not change the setting and lower the difficulty for mages to learn spells, they would delete their characters and ask for a refund. Roland sighed. Things had happened exactly as he expected. It remained to be seen how the game producers would handle it. Chapter 18, Go Away If You Don't Want to Play. The official announcement was released at noon. It was elaborate and written in a friendly tone, but it could be summarized into one short sentence: go away if you don't want to play, and we will give you a full refund for your virtual cabin. Considering that second-hand virtual cabins were already $20,000 more expensive than the originals on the market, only an idiot would have asked for a refund. The game producer's announcement indicated their confidence and pride. They had every reason to be proud after having developed such a game, or at least Roland thought so. He could tell that the game was based on Dungeons and Dragons. He did not know much about the rules of Dungeons and Dragons, but he was aware that mages truly had to learn spells on their own under such rules. The game producers had only represented the rule in their game. Besides, according to the setting, mages were supposed to be a rare class. Roland estimated that the game producers were using such a strategy to limit the number of mages and push them to become warlocks, priests, or other melee classes. If that was the case, the game producers had indeed put a lot of thought into it. After all, mages were a powerful class in all fantasy games. That was why they were called master mages. If there were too many players of an up class, the balance of the game would definitely be affected. Significantly increasing the difficulty of the class was not a bad way to limit its population. After all, most players agreed that the more difficult a class was and the more resources it required, the more powerful it would be in the future. But of course, after the game producers gave such a reply, there would certainly be a storm of criticism on the internet. Their competitors would certainly take advantage of the chance to smear the game. A lot of haters would emerge in every topic that involved this game. The whole internet would be a mess. After all, World of Fallen, as the first immersive game worldwide, had been under the spotlight on the internet since it was launched. The sales of the first batch of virtual cabins did not go well at the beginning. After all, Penguin Corporation was notorious for its history of counterfeits. People did not believe that it had developed an immersive game. Could such a company achieve something that even the leading game companies failed to? With such thoughts, many people mocked Penguin Corporation on the internet, at home and abroad. The first 500,000 virtual cabins were gradually sold over a period of half a year. Roland did not believe that Penguin Corporation had truly developed an immersive game. However, the MMORPGs he had played since childhood were all made by Penguin Corporation. Penguin Corporation had given him a happy childhood. For that, Roland decided to buy a virtual cabin. After all, Penguin Corporation was a big company. Even if it was not a real immersive game, it should be something close, or Penguin Corporation wouldn't have promoted it so hard. Nobody expected that the game was as immersive as it claimed to be. As the first immersive game worldwide, it was at the cutting edge of this era. However unsatisfied the players were, they wouldn't give up the chance to play it. The players who thought that Mage was too difficult a class might complain and refrain from playing the game for a few days, but it was hardly unlikely that they would return or sell the virtual cabins. Otherwise, the price of second-hand virtual cabins wouldn't have increased by $20,000. Roland turned off the forum and played a few games that he liked in the past, only to discover that he couldn't enjoy them. He worked out on the treadmill for half an hour and biked on the street. He somehow felt that enjoying the scenery on the street was more fun than playing regular games in his room. Late at night, when he was about to enter the game, it suddenly occurred to him that he hadn't enjoyed regular video games for days. Could this immersive game cure computer addiction? Thinking about that, Roland entered the game again. Roland did not mine again. He had saved 2 silver coins. 100 coppers could be exchanged for 1 silver coin. He was now wealthier than half the people in town. He was not tired of mining. After all, nobody could have too much money. He merely felt that, since he was level 2, he'd better test his combat ability, and the giant spiders were the best targets. He came to the temple, and Falcon happened to be there. So, he asked for language proficiency, then returned to the town and bought a longsword from the blacksmith. Although it was odd for a mage to use a longsword, he hadn't learned any spells for self-defense yet. Should a spider approach him, a longsword might prove of use. Then, he bought some herbs that could stop bleeding from the grocery store. After putting everything in his backpack, he crossed the bridge and walked out of town. On the bridge at the entrance of the town, he saw Falcon. The wind on the lake was cool and gentle. The hunched, white-haired old man put on a kind smile when he saw Roland. "Falcon, why are you here? You're not guiding the believers at the temple? Just now, Jack ran to me from the blacksmith's shop and told me that you bought a longsword, so I came here to wait for you." Roland noticed the sweat on Falcon's forehead. The old man was also slowly panting with his hands behind his back. "I'm planning to test my spells. Practice is of little use. Spells can only be measured in a real battle." "You're going to fight the giant spiders?" asked Falcon. Roland nodded. "You can resurrect. For the likes of you, battle is just entertainment, but dying too many times can't be good." Falcon removed his hands from his back. He was holding a straight stick which had a small sapphire at the end. "This is the staff I used when I was young. You can take it." Any experienced player knew how expensive magical items could be. Besides, having saved a lot of money through mining over the past days, Roland knew the astonishing purchase power of money in this game world. Honey bread was sold at only 2 coppers, but honey was actually a luxurious sweet. Few villagers could afford honey. Besides, 1 large barrel of ale, which was enough to fill the stomachs of several adults, cost only 2 coppers, too. 1 copper could buy 2 kilograms of raw rice, 1 kilogram of river fish, and several kilograms of regular fruits in season. Roland had meals in Lakeview Tavern most of the time in the past days. He overheard the bragging of the customers there now and then when language proficiency was effective on him. He remembered one particular remark clearly. Even the cheapest magical item would cost more than 10 silver coins. Chapter 19, The Romance in Every Man's Heart. On the village road, Roland looked at the magic staff in his hand. Magical items were very expensive, but Falcon still gave him the staff. Was it a reward when his intimacy with the NPC surpassed a certain threshold, a prerequisite of a certain quest, or simply a choice that Falcon had made as a human being? Roland's puzzlement was quite understandable. After all, he was now in a game. According to common sense, since he was in a game, the item should be related to a quest. Yet, Roland felt that it was not so simple. Both Falcon and other people in the village impressed him as living souls with their own emotions, instead of NPCs. Although they were merely artificial intelligence according to the promotion of the game, Roland did not feel that they were any different from real people. Was he really in an immersive game? Or was it a real world with human beings in the flesh? Those people even had their own languages, customs, and history. Could a game team have come up with so many things? Roland found it unlikely. If they were capable of that, They could have been hired by think tanks to infer the history and future of the whole world. It was extremely sophisticated stuff. Yet, the window of the system popping up before his eyes convinced him that he was only in a game. Name: Mini Sapphire Magic Staff. Excellent. Attributes: Casting Concentration +2, Magic Power Regeneration +1. Introduction: a rather common staff, but can be used for a lifetime if maintained properly. Then, he looked at his own body, and another translucent window popped up. Name: White Magic Robe. Excellent. Attributes: Magic Power Regeneration +2. Introduction: an unattractive long robe, which is likely the very first gear for apprentices. Roland sighed. He did not know how other players viewed the NPCs in the game, but as for himself, he could not consider the human-like NPCs as experience for him to level up as he did in other games. However, it was not a problem for him to kill the bizarre wildlife. The maple forest was right up ahead. Roland looked at his staff and his longsword. Taking a deep breath, he walked into the forest slowly. As he pressed deeper and deeper, the woods became dimmer and dimmer. The quiet here was occasionally interrupted by the chirping of birds from unknown corners. Roland stepped on a thick carpet of rotten leaves, which crackled under his feet. He smelled a strange smell of fermentation. Despite knowing that he would be resurrected if he died, Roland inevitably felt scared in such an environment. He walked forward prudently and stayed on full alert. Even the tiniest noise would make his heart palpitate. He looked at the sources of the noises, and they were mostly caused by uncanny creatures. This special feeling of fear and anticipation reminded him of Resident Evil 2, which he played when he was 7. It was both thrilling and enjoyable. After another 3 minutes, Roland noticed white, broken spiderwebs at the bottom of the trees around him. He also heard the rattling sounds from ahead, as if someone was churning leaves with sticks. It must be the giant spiders. Roland squatted and took a soft breath. A giant, crimson spider emerged in the darkness slowly. The spider did not seem to notice him, but Roland's heart was racing as the spider approached. He remembered a famous line he read on the internet. Hesitation meant failure. A lion always tried its best even though it was only catching a hare. Concentrating all his magic power, Roland launched a big blue fireball the size of a basin. After shooting it out, Roland immediately ran back and crouched. The fireball grew larger in size as it flew on. Soon, it reached the giant spider. Most animals were scared of fire, and the giant spiders were no exception. The fireball collapsed rapidly at first, before it exploded at an extremely high speed. The sound and flare of the explosion suggested that a bomb had just been detonated. Before the giant spider realized what was going on, it had been consumed by the furious flames. Then, fire and smoke rose like a tiny mushroom. Even though he was outside of the range of the explosion, Roland was flung away by an enormous blast. He was lifted with a pile of dry leaves and fell to the ground. Then, hot air brushed past his head. Thankfully, the leaves were thick enough to prevent him from being hurt. Then, he struggled back to his feet, only to be rendered speechless by what he had caused. Before him was a gigantic pit, with dark red magma flowing at the bottom. The trees nearby were burning and cracking. A stretch of land at least half the size of a football field had been razed to the ground by the explosion. Many trees leaned away in radial circles. Within the blast radius, nothing but a few tree trunks that had been reduced to charcoal could be seen. Such power! Roland collapsed on the ground. His magic power had been used up. The power of the fireball was much greater than back when he was in Red Mountain Town. It was probably because his level had improved, and because the staff had enhanced his power. In any case, the power of the spell was beyond Roland's imagination. It was hardly possible for a melee class to do the same at the beginning phase of the game. He didn't think warlocks could achieve this, either. It was said that the power to cast a spell for a warlock was fixed or set to a certain ratio that could not be changed. It meant that, if compared to cars, warlocks would be the at-ones, and the mages would be the mount-ones. As everyone knew, the best cars for racing were all mount-ones. Roland moved his body further away from the site of the explosion. He did not have much strength left. Thankfully, it was rather damp in the forest, and the fire did not spread out but started dying out. Sitting still, he enjoyed the dreadful scene that he caused in fascination and satisfaction. It was truly exhilarating to possess such a destructive power. What couldn't be done in reality could be achieved in the game. In this world that was almost entirely vivid, he could do things that he couldn't imagine in the past. The mage dream he had when he was a little kid was now fulfilled. Roland chuckled with ambitiousness and determination that he hadn't felt in years. A fantasy world of swords and magic was always the greatest romance in every boy's heart. Chapter 20, A New Guy Joins. After the mountain fire completely died out, Roland shook the leaves and ash off his body, then walked back to Red Mountain Town. He was very slow, because he was out of magic power. The regeneration effect provided by his equipment was not very obvious. Without magic power, he seemed much weaker. When he returned to the bridge at the entrance of the village, he was greeted by Falcon as well as a bunch of villagers. Seeing that he was back, the villagers hailed him and asked if he was fine. Falcon reached him and cast language proficiency at him. Then he said with a smile, "It was quite a commotion that you caused." Roland turned around, only to discover a black spot on the green hill in the distance. It was as eye-catching as a bald spot on a beautiful girl's head. Roland shrugged and smiled awkwardly. How did it turn out? The other villagers looked at him hopefully. Everybody in Red Mountain Town loathed the giant spiders and hoped that someone could kill them. It was my first battle. I was too nervous and inexperienced, and I used too much strength, said Roland in embarrassment. I only killed one giant spider. After a brief silence, the villagers cheered. They hated the spider's guts, but there was little they could do. A few friendly villagers approached Roland and patted Roland's shoulder, inviting him to visit their houses. Roland declined their offers politely, knowing that it was only their gesture of kindness. The villagers dispersed, and Falcon and Roland were left alone on the bridge. The sun was setting at this moment. When the crimson sun was reflected in the lake and the waves surged, the lake seemed to be burning. It was rather beautiful. Looking at him, Falcon suddenly said, "You seem to have changed. Is it so obvious?" Roland was slightly surprised. He leaned on the rail and said slowly while gazing at the hills in the distance, "I just remembered my dream, or rather, what I looked forward to in the past. I thought it was an ungrounded fantasy that had been broken by reality. However, it was revived and occurred to me all over again." Falcon noticed a strange light in Roland's eyes, barely visible but which gave off a feeling of brightness. Once upon a time, Falcon had such light in his own eyes, too. "So, have you changed your plans?" asked Falcon. Roland shook his head. "No, I'm still going to travel and roam around." Roland's tone was rather unfathomable thanks to the breeze from the lake. Falcon was slightly stunned. Roland's answer was the same, except that he said it with a gentler tone this time. Yet, Falcon heard determination in it. Previously, Roland's answer was passive, as if he was forced to do it. But right now, he sounded as if he had found a goal for himself. Why did the same reply feel so different? Dazed, Falcon shook his head helplessly. He remembered a lot of things. He was equally ambitious when he was young. Roland took out the staff and gave it to him. "This is yours. It was a great help. It's a gift for you." Falcon turned around and walked away while he said casually, "If you think you owe me a favor, kill a few more giant spiders. This should be a quest, but why isn't there any notification?" thought Roland as he looked at Falcon's back. He returned to his cottage. After eating some of the bread he bought from Lakeview Tavern, he studied the mathematical models of the new spells again. Time flew when he was occupied. It seemed that only a moment had passed, but Roland was already ejected from the game. After he left the game cabin, he copied the video of his battle against the giant spider and uploaded it to the forum. Then, he wrote, "Maybe mages cannot cast a spell as easily as warlocks can, or level up as conveniently as priests, but mages have their own advantages. We can analyze spells, modify them, and thereby create new spells. I've never raided in the game until yesterday, and I used full power in this vivid environment. It's just a derivative spell of level 1 inferior fireball, but it's already so powerful. What about the spells of second rings or better? What if our levels are higher? Personally speaking, I think that although mages are weak at the beginning, they will definitely dominate all spellcasters in the future. After writing that, he posted his thread. Soon, someone replied to it. More and more replies were posted. After he refreshed the thread, there were already 20 replies. You said that you were not a crazy bomber? This is unbelievable. How did you extract all your magic power and focus it on one spell? I am a mage, too, but I can only deploy about 30% of my magic power. Uncle Sam suspects that you own weapons of mass destruction. Please go with the FBI agents. This is unfair. I'm a LV2 warlock, and my inferior fireball can only penetrate through a seedling. By logic, the magic damage of warlocks should be much higher than that of mages of the same level. I'll delete my character and join as a mage. The sound and visual effects of this explosion are exciting. Roland, do you need fans who adore you? I'll friend you. Go away. You are not a real fan. Roland shook his head helplessly as the replies deviated from the subject. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. He accepted the call, and his friend Chuck's voice came over. Bro, come to my place. My cousin has joined the game, too. According to his description, he seems to have been born somewhere near Red Mountain Town. All right, I am on my way. Roland hung up the phone and rode his bike to the cold drink bar. In their booth, he saw a young man who was around 18 and looked somewhat similar to Chuck. Lying on the sofa in a great mood, Chuck introduced, "This is my cousin, Beta. He has been studying hard since elementary school. My uncle never allowed him to play games, but now that the college entrance exam is over, he is set free. Brother Roland, hello." Beta greeted Roland with a smile. Hi. This is Novel Admire. Thanks for the visit. Come back again for more novels.